The fence post snapped clean in half the moment Jennie Gentry grabbed it, and that was the exact second that Jasper Vaughn decided she was either the bravest woman he had ever laid eyes on or the most reckless fool west of the Mississippi River. He had been watching her from across the pasture for 3 full minutes, arms crossed over his chest, jaw set like granite, saying absolutely nothing. That was how he handled most things, with silence so thick and cold it could frost the window panes in July. Every soul in Redemption Creek, Wyoming, had warned her about him. The blacksmith had said it first, wiping grease from his hands and shaking his head slowly. "That man is carved out of the same stone as these mountains, Miss Gentry, cold through and through. You knock on his door, you might as well knock on a cliff face for all the good it'll do you." The widow Hargrove at the boarding house had leaned in close over breakfast that very morning, voice dropped to a whisper like she was confessing to a priest, and said, "Nobody reaches Jasper Vaughn. 3 men tried to buy that northern parcel from him last spring. He sent them walking before they finished their first sentence." A woman from Denver, educated, well-dressed, charming as spring rain, tried to negotiate water rights with him 6 months ago. She left crying, "Nobody reaches him, child." Nobody. Jennie had listened to all of it. She had thanked them politely. And then she had ridden straight out to the boundary line of the Vaughn Ranch on a Tuesday morning in May of 1882 with a leather satchel full of survey maps, a sharp pencil tucked behind her ear, and absolutely no intention of failing. The fence post, it turned out, was the first real opening she had found. She had noticed it the moment she dismounted, a rotted corner post on the eastern boundary of his property, where it abutted the parcel she had just purchased with every cent she had saved from 4 years of surveying work across 3 territories. The post was not merely damaged. It was structurally compromised in a way that told a very specific geological story, and Jennie Gentry, who held a surveying certificate from the Colorado School of Mines and had more practical experience reading land and soil composition than most men twice her age, recognized that story immediately. She pulled the post free from the ground, examined the base, and looked up to find 6 feet 2 inches of cold, silent, thoroughly unimpressed rancher standing 15 feet away from her on his side of the line, staring at her with pale gray eyes that gave absolutely nothing away. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight enough to sing. Jennie held up the rotted post and asked him the question that changed everything. "Is your soil in this quadrant showing alkaline deposits across the whole eastern length, or just near the creek bend?" He did not answer immediately. The silence lasted long enough that a hawk circled overhead and landed in a cottonwood 30 yards away. But Jasper Vaughn's eyes had shifted just slightly, just enough for someone paying very close attention to notice. From the blankly dismissive look he gave to trespassers and unwanted visitors to something sharper, something that looked uncomfortably close to surprise. But to understand why that question cracked the first hairline fracture in the coldest man in Redemption Creek, and why Jennie Gentry was standing at his fence line at all on a Tuesday morning in May, and why every secret and hidden motive and buried heartbreak that lived inside Jasper Vaughn was about to be pulled into the open light like a splinter drawn out of a wound. You had to go back to the beginning of it all, back to the afternoon 4 weeks earlier, when Jennie first arrived in Redemption Creek on the afternoon stage, stepping down into the dust with her satchel and her maps and her absolutely unshakable sense of purpose, into a town that had no idea whatsoever what to do with her. Redemption Creek sat in a shallow valley in the eastern Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1882, a town of approximately 400 souls that survived on cattle, a modest silver claim 3 miles north, and the stubborn frontier conviction that tomorrow would be better than today. It had one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a livery stable at the south end, a church at the north, and somewhere in between those 2 bookends of civilization, all the ordinary drama and daily stakes and quiet desperation of frontier life. Jennie Gentry was 26 years old, and she had arrived in Redemption Creek for one specific purpose. She had purchased, through a land office in Cheyenne, a 160-acre parcel that sat adjacent to the Vaughn Ranch on the east side, and she intended to build something on it. Not a homesteader's claim, not a simple sod house to prove up and then sell. She intended to build a working farm with a carefully engineered irrigation system based on her survey of the regional watershed, a system she had been designing in her notebooks for 2 years, a system that could turn dry grassland into productive cropland and eventually support a permanent community rather than just transient cattle operations. This was not a small ambition. In 1882, Wyoming Territory, a single woman purchasing land and announcing plans to engineer an irrigation system was the kind of thing that made strong men laugh into their coffee cups. She had encountered that laughter before, in Denver, in Cheyenne, in a dozen surveying offices where she had walked in with her credentials and walked out with the job anyway because her calculations were simply better than anyone else's, and eventually even the most skeptical men had to admit it. She had been the daughter of a surveyor, a brilliant, passionate man named Thomas Gentry, who had dragged his only child across 3 territories from the time she was 8 years old, teaching her to read land the way other fathers taught their children to read books. By the time she was 16, Jennie could run a survey line and calculate elevation changes with more accuracy than most trained professionals. By the time she was 20, she had done it professionally in Colorado. By 23, she had her certificate, her reputation, and a growing savings account that had finally, at 26, become enough to buy her own piece of the West. The problem, the first significant obstacle, the hidden trap she had not fully anticipated when she bought the parcel was water rights. The creek that gave Redemption Creek its name ran down from the northern hills and crossed directly through the eastern corner of Jasper Vaughn's ranch before it reached her parcel. Without access to that water flow, or at minimum a formal understanding of the shared watershed, her irrigation plans were not merely complicated. They were impossible. She had known, before she ever arrived, that the water rights question would need to be negotiated with the owner of the Vaughn Ranch. She had done her research in the Cheyenne land office. She knew his name. She knew the rough dimensions of his property. What she had not fully anticipated was the force of his reputation in Redemption Creek, the sheer wall of warning she walked into from the moment she stepped off the stage and introduced herself to anyone who would listen. Jasper Vaughn, the livery man had said when she mentioned the adjacent parcel, and he had said the name the way you'd say the name of a coming storm. "Good luck to you, ma'am." That had been the first warning. There had been 8 more in the first 3 days. By the end of her first week in Redemption Creek, Jennie Gentry had a room at the Hargrove boarding house, a working knowledge of the town's social architecture, and a very detailed picture of the man she needed to speak to. The picture was not encouraging, at least not to anyone else. To Jennie, who had learned to look past the surface story to the geological structure underneath, it was interesting. Jasper Vaughn was 32 years old and had owned the ranch outright since he was 24, when his father died of a fever that had swept through the valley in a particularly brutal winter. He had come back from that loss and from something else, something darker that people in Redemption Creek spoke about only in careful fragments and sideways references, by becoming someone who worked without stopping and spoke without wasting. He ran 700 head of cattle on 4,000 acres of Wyoming grassland, and he ran it well, by all accounts. The ranch was profitable. The land was well managed. His fences were always good, his water troughs always full, his cattle always healthy. Except, apparently, for the one corner post on the eastern boundary, which had been left to rot. The reason behind that specific neglect was the second crack in the picture, the second detail Jennie filed away in the sharp and tireless machinery of her mind. A man as meticulous as the description of Jasper Vaughn did not let a fence post rot by accident. He let it rot because That corner of the property held something he did not want to think about. She had not yet known what that something was when she rode out to the boundary line on that Tuesday morning. She had simply seen the post, recognized the opportunity it presented, not as manipulation, but as a genuine professional question that happened to also require human contact, and asked the question. The alkaline soil question. The question that made Jasper Vaughn's cold gray eyes shift. He looked at her for another long moment after she asked it, and then he looked at the post in her hands, and then he looked at the ground where she had pulled it free. His jaw tightened. Something moved across his face that was not quite an expression, more like the shadow of one, passing through and disappearing before it could be named. East side runs alkaline from the creek bend south about 300 yards, he said. His voice was low and measured, carrying no warmth whatsoever but also, notably, no dismissal. Why? Jennie set the post down carefully and brushed the soil from her palms. Because the alkaline deposit changes the load-bearing quality of the subsoil, and if your fence line was set without accounting for that, your posts have been losing structural integrity from the bottom up since they were placed. This one has been compromised for probably 3 years. You have more like it. I can show you where. The silence this time was different. It was not the silence of a man choosing not to respond. It was the silence of a man who had just been told something accurate that he had not expected from this source. "You're the woman who bought the Morton parcel," he said. "I am. Jennie Gentry." She did not extend her hand across the property line. She simply met his gaze with the same steady, direct calm she brought to every survey she had ever run. "I have a professional interest in the watershed question that connects our properties, Mr. Vaughn. I would like to discuss it with you. But I thought you should also know about your fence, because it matters for your own operation regardless of anything between our properties." He looked at her for a very long time. The hawk in the cottonwood called once and lifted off. The spring wind moved through the dry grass in long, slow waves. "Come to the house at 7 tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll look at the survey maps." He turned and walked back toward the ranch house without another word. Jennie watched him go, feeling the carefully contained thrill of someone who has just found the one crack in a geological formation that everyone else insisted was solid all the way through. She was back at the Hargrove house by noon, and when she told the widow that Jasper Vaughn had agreed to meet with her, the woman set down her coffee cup with a small thud and stared as if Jennie had just announced she had flown to the moon. "How on earth?" The widow breathed. "I asked him about his soil," Jennie said simply. She did not sleep well that night, not because she was nervous or not only because of that. It was something else, something she did not quite have language for yet, a restlessness that had less to do with the professional negotiation ahead of her and more to do with the way those pale gray eyes had shifted when she asked the right question. She was not a woman who indulged in romantic distraction. She had come to Redemption Creek to build something real on her own land, and she had work to do. But she was also honest enough with herself, in the quiet of the boarding house bedroom with the Wyoming night pressing dark against the window pane, to admit that Jasper Vaughn was not at all what she had expected, and that the unexpected had always interested her more than the predictable. She was at the ranch gate at 5 minutes to 7 the next morning. The Vaughn ranch house was a solid, handsome structure, not grand, but built with the careful precision of someone who understood that in Wyoming, the quality of your construction was a matter of survival. The barn was large and well kept. The yard between the house and the barn was clean. Everything about the place spoke of a man who paid attention to what mattered and wasted nothing. Jasper Vaughn opened the door before she could knock, which told her he had been watching for her. He was wearing a clean work shirt and had clearly shaved that morning, which told her something too, though she was careful not to read too much into small details when she was in the middle of a professional negotiation. He showed her to a large table in the main room of the house, and she spread her survey maps across it without ceremony, anchoring the corners with her pencil case and the small brass compass that had been her father's. She began walking him through her analysis of the watershed in the calm, technical language of her profession, pointing to contour lines and notations, explaining her irrigation proposal in concrete terms. He listened. That was the first thing that surprised her, not the polite half-listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but genuine, focused attention. He leaned over the maps with his hands flat on the table and his eyes moving across the notations, and twice he asked questions that told her he understood what she was showing him. Real questions, precise questions. "Your gradient calculation here," he said, pressing one finger to a point on the map. "You're accounting for seasonal flow variation." "Yes. I have 3 years of watershed data from the regional survey reports, plus my own field measurements from the past 2 weeks. The creek runs approximately 40% higher volume in the April-May period than the August-September low point. The irrigation design accounts for the variance with a gravity-fed holding basin here," she pointed, "that buffers against seasonal drought stress." He was quiet for a moment, studying the notation. "That's where my father tried to dig a well in 1871, he said. "Hit bedrock at 9 feet. Quit." Jennie looked at him. "The bedrock shelf is actually ideal for a basin foundation. You'd need to blast rather than dig, but it becomes a permanent water retention structure rather than just a well. The bedrock holds it." Something shifted in his face again, that same barely there expression she had seen at the fence line. She had the feeling he was reassessing something, though she could not have said what. "What do you want from my side of the property line?" he asked. It was not an unfriendly question. It was a direct one. "A water rights agreement that allows me to run a secondary draw from the creek at the point where it crosses your eastern boundary," Jennie said. "In exchange, I'm offering to extend my irrigation design to cover your eastern pastures, the alkaline-compromised section. Properly managed water and soil amendment in that quadrant could increase your grazing capacity there by 30 to 40%. That section is currently your least productive land. It doesn't have to be." The silence that followed was long but not hostile. He was thinking. She could see it. "How do you know what my eastern pastures yield?" he asked. "I've been surveying this valley for 2 weeks, Mr. Vaughn. It's my job to know the land." He pushed back from the table and stood straight, looking at her with those steady gray eyes that gave very little away but gave just slightly more than nothing when you paid close attention. "I'll need to think about it," he said. It was not a yes. But it was not the summary dismissal that everyone in Redemption Creek had predicted. Jennie rolled her maps back into their case and picked up her father's compass and understood that she had been given more ground than anyone else had managed, and that the work of reaching Jasper Vaughn was not finished, but it had genuinely begun. She came back the next day to show him the compromised fence posts she had promised to identify, and this time she had her own tools. A soil probe and a small hand level she used to demonstrate the subsidence patterns in the ground. He walked the fence line beside her in silence for the most part, but he was watching everything she did with a focused attention that felt different from what she was used to. Most men who were forced to accept her professional expertise managed it with a kind of grudging, slightly resentful acknowledgement. Jasper Vaughn watched her work the way you watched something you hadn't seen before and wanted to understand. She found 7 more compromised posts in 200 yards of fence line. She marked each one with a small strip of red cloth she pulled from her pocket, and she explained to him the soil chemistry that had caused each one to fail, and she showed him the pattern on her survey map that predicted exactly where the next failures would occur if they weren't addressed. He was quiet for a long time at the last marked post. Then he said, without looking at her, "My foreman told me this fence was solid 2 years ago." "Your foreman was reading the surface," Jennie said. "The failure starts underground." He looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes not soft, not warm, but genuine. The look of a man who had been in the habit of trusting his own judgment and had just discovered a gap in it that someone else had filled with precise and useful information. "How long have you been doing survey work?" he asked. "Since I was 8 years old," Jennie said. "My father was a surveyor. I've been doing it professionally for 8 years. He nodded slowly and said nothing more. But when she started back toward the gate, he walked with her, not as an escort, not with any particular social grace, just as a man who was apparently not finished being in the same place as this particular person. Over the following 2 weeks, they developed something that was not quite a professional arrangement and not quite a friendship, and was several degrees warmer than either of those things, though neither of them named it. Jasper came out to the fence line on 3 mornings when Jennie was working there, and each time he stayed longer than the last. He helped her pull the compromised posts and set new ones, not because she asked, but because he showed up with a post hole digger on the 3rd morning and started working without explanation, and she was smart enough not to make a speech about it and simply worked alongside him. She learned pieces of him during those mornings. He was methodical and exact with his hands, the way her father had been. He had opinions about soil and grass management that were more sophisticated than the average rancher, drawn from years of careful observation. He had read more books than anyone in Redemption Creek seemed to know. She saw the shelves when she came to the house a second time for a longer meeting about the water rights proposal, and the selection was not what she would have predicted. History, engineering, natural philosophy, a well-worn copy of Darwin's work that would have caused the Reverend Porter heartburn if he'd seen it. She asked him about the Darwin. He said he found it more interesting than most of the sermons he had sat through. It was the closest thing to a joke she had heard from him, delivered perfectly flat, and she laughed genuinely, and something in his face shifted in a way that was new and slightly startling. A brief, unguarded response to her laugh, there and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it. She asked him, on the 6th morning they worked together, about the section of property he had not shown her yet, the far north corner, near the old homestead claim that the land records showed had predated the Vaughn ranch by several years. She had seen it on her survey maps, and it sat like a knot in the otherwise clean picture of the property, a small, irregular parcel with a different history from the rest. He went very still when she mentioned it. "That section is not part of the water rights discussion," he said, and the temperature dropped about 10 degrees, and every wall she had spent 2 weeks carefully dismantling went back up in the space of a second. Jennie held her ground. She did not push because she was not stupid and she was not reckless, but she did not retreat either. "I'm not asking about it for the negotiation," she said honestly. "It showed up in my survey work as an anomaly. I noted it, that's all." He picked up the post hole digger and moved to the next marked post and drove it into the earth with considerably more force than was technically necessary. She let it go, but she did not forget it. The water rights agreement was formally signed on a Friday afternoon in the Redemption Creek Land Office, with the Territory land agent acting as witness. It was a fair agreement, carefully worded, and the land agent later told 3 different people that it was the most professionally drafted private water rights document he had processed in 10 years of practice, which said something about the quality of Jennie Gentry's preparation. When they walked out of the land office onto the main street of Redemption Creek, blinking in the bright afternoon light, there was a small, strange moment of suspension. The business concluded, the professional reason for their daily contact officially formalized, and something else unnamed and unresolved hanging in the air between them. "I appreciate the fair terms," he said. "They were fair for both sides," she replied. "That was the point." He nodded and looked down the street for a moment, and then he said, with the quality of a man speaking carefully around something he was not sure about, "If you need help breaking ground on the basin, I have a team and equipment." It was an offer that went beyond what the agreement required. They both knew it. "I may take you up on that," Jennie said. He nodded again and walked toward the livery stable. She watched him go and felt the same restlessness she had felt the first night in her boarding house room, now considerably more specific and considerably more pointed. The widow Hargrove, who had been watching from the boarding house porch across the street, met Jennie on the steps with an expression of profound bewilderment. "You walked out of the land office with Jasper Vaughn," she said. "We signed the water rights agreement," Jennie said. "Jennie, child, I have lived in this valley for 19 years. I have never seen that man walk down a public street with anyone." Jennie went upstairs to her room and spread her irrigation plans across the small desk and stared at them for a long time and made very little progress. The groundbreaking for the irrigation basin happened on a Monday in June, which meant Jennie had been in Redemption Creek for 6 weeks and had accomplished more in that time than most people managed in a year on the frontier. Jasper brought his team 3 hands, a pair of draft horses, and the equipment needed for the heavy work of moving earth, and he arrived before 7 and worked alongside everyone without the particular performance of authority that some men in his position put on. Jennie ran the operation. She had her stakes and measuring rods set out across the basin site, marked to exact specifications, and she directed the work with the calm precision of someone who had run survey operations in rougher conditions than a Wyoming morning. The hands took their direction from her without question, partly because she was clearly the technical authority, and partly because Jasper was obviously taking his direction from her, and nobody on his payroll was in the habit of contradicting Jasper Vaughn about anything. Late in the morning, there was a problem. The initial blast to break the bedrock surface for the basin foundation revealed a fault line in the rock that ran at an angle to the planned excavation. It was not a crisis, but it was a significant complication. It meant the original basin dimensions would need to be revised to account for the fault, or they risked structural instability in the basin floor. Jennie was on her knees in the excavation within 5 minutes of the discovery, examining the fault line with a hand lens and her soil probe, running her hands along the exposed rock face. She pulled out her field notebook and began making calculations with the quick, decisive strokes of someone who had solved problems like this before. And then she repositioned the survey stakes to mark a revised basin outline that accommodated the fault line while maintaining 92% of the original capacity. Jasper had come down into the excavation beside her without her noticing, and she looked up from her notebook to find him watching her work with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not the carefully contained, almost expression she had been cataloging for 6 weeks. It was open astonishment, pure, unguarded, slightly undone astonishment at what he was watching. "You just redesigned the basin in 11 minutes, he said. 12, she said, glancing at her watch. "The fault line actually improves the drainage gradient if we offset the south wall by 8 feet. We'll get better seasonal drawdown from the configuration." He said nothing for a long moment. She could feel his gaze in a way that was distinct from the professional attention she had grown accustomed to from him, something heavier and more personal and significantly less easy to categorize. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. "My father," Jennie said, "and 2 surveying expeditions into the Colorado mountains where the geology was considerably less cooperative than this. A fault line in bedrock is a problem that has a solution. It just takes a few minutes to find it." He looked at the revised stake positions and then back at her. The astonishment had not entirely left his face. "Most men I know would have spent 3 days arguing about whether to abandon the site," he said. "Most men I know would have been right," Jennie said, standing and brushing the dust from her knees. "This site is worth the complication. The fault line doesn't undermine the structure, it redirects it. There's a difference." She went back to work. He stayed in the excavation for another moment, looking at the revised stake positions, and when he climbed back out and rejoined his team, she thought she heard him say something very quietly, almost to himself. She could not be entirely sure, because the wind was up and the team was moving equipment, but she thought it sounded like the word remarkable. She filed that away and said nothing and kept working, and did not allow herself to smile until she was facing away from him. The summer moved forward the way Wyoming summers do, fast and hot and brilliant, the sky an impossible deep blue above the dry gold of the grassland. The basin excavation was completed by mid-June. The diversion channel from the creek was cut and lined in the last week of the month. By the 1st of July, Jennie's irrigation system was holding water and beginning the slow transformation of the dry eastern parcel into something that would, by next spring, be productive cropland. She was building her house in the same period, a smaller, practical structure positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds and sun angle, designed with the same careful attention to the land that she brought to everything. She had hired 2 local carpenters from town and was supplementing their work with her own, which caused considerable comment in Redemption Creek, but not notably from the direction of the Vaughn Ranch. Jasper Vaughn had taken to stopping by her property on Tuesday mornings under the professional pretext of checking on the shared irrigation infrastructure, a practice that was technically legitimate for approximately the first 2 Tuesdays, and then became something else entirely while still being called the same thing. He would arrive on horseback, dismount, examine the water levels in the basin with genuine professional interest, and then drift toward wherever Jennie was working and find reasons to be useful. He was very useful. He was strong and capable, and he understood construction in the practical frontier sense of someone who had built and repaired things his whole life. He helped her raise the roof beams on a Wednesday in late June when the 2 carpenters were struggling, and she needed a 3rd set of hands and did not have them. He appeared without invitation in the manner she was beginning to recognize as his particular style, assessed the situation, and climbed onto the structure without a word, and worked for 4 hours straight without complaint. When they finally got the last beam set, and she climbed down the ladder and looked up at the skeleton of her house standing solid against the summer sky, she felt the particular fierce pride of someone who has made something real out of something that was once only a plan in a notebook. She turned to say thank you and found Jasper Vaughn standing 3 feet away, watching her with an expression that had none of the careful containment she had come to expect. He looked at her the way he had looked at the revised survey stakes in the excavation, but more so, with something that was past astonishment and into something else, something that lived in the territory of feelings he had apparently been walling off for a very long time. "You're going to stay," he said. It was not quite a question. "I built an irrigation system and I'm building a house," Jennie said. "Yes, I'm staying." He nodded slowly. Then he looked away up at the roof beams and said very quietly, "Good." They stood in silence for a moment that was nothing at all like the loaded silence he used on unwanted visitors. It was the opposite of that. It was the kind of silence that had something warm and real living inside it, something neither of them was quite ready to name, but both of them were very much aware of. "I'm making coffee," Jennie said. "If you want some." He accepted. They sat on the partial front porch of her unfinished house in the long summer afternoon and drank bad camp coffee out of tin cups and really talked, for the first time without the professional map between them as a safe intermediary. She told him about her father, about the survey expeditions through the Colorado mountains, about the year she had spent in Denver trying to find work and being turned away from half a dozen offices before she found one willing to look past the fact that she was a woman and evaluate her actual work. She told him about the idea that had become the irrigation plan, not the technical details, but the original idea, the vision of turning marginal land productive through careful engineering, the belief that the frontier did not have to be a place you simply survived, but a place you could genuinely build something in. He listened the way he always did, with complete focused attention, no interruptions, no attempts to redirect the conversation to himself. But this time, when she finished, he did not simply nod and return to professional business. He told her about his father, not the sanitized version that the town knew, the decent man who died too young and left his son a good ranch. He told her about the harder version, the truth underneath the surface story. His father had been a stubborn, complicated man who had loved the land passionately and loved people badly, who had been difficult to reach and difficult to live with, and who had, in his last years, become increasingly isolated from everyone who might have helped him. Jasper had watched that isolation from the inside, living on the ranch beside it, and had understood with the helpless clarity of someone who could see a geological problem forming underground but had no tools to address it. After his father died, Jasper had spent 2 years building walls of his own, not as an intentional decision, but as the natural result of a man who had watched isolation destroy someone he loved and had internalized the lesson backwards, turning it into self-protection rather than self-awareness. He had worked without stopping. He had maintained the ranch with meticulous precision. He had kept the world at the exact distance where it could do him no damage, and he could do it no damage in return. He did not say all of this in those terms. He said it in the concrete, understated language of a man who did not often speak about his own interior, in fragments and careful sentences separated by silences. But Jennie, who had spent 26 years learning to read the structure beneath the surface, understood every word of what he was saying and every silence between the words. "The north corner," she said quietly, when he had gone silent for a long moment. It was a risk. She knew it was a risk. But she had learned that direct honesty was the only real tool she had with him. He wrapped both hands around his tin cup and looked at the horizon for a long moment. "My father had a partnership with a man named Caldwell," he said finally. "Aaron Caldwell. They built this ranch together in 1869, the two of them from nothing. My father put in the cattle and the capital. Caldwell put in the labor and the north parcel. He homesteaded it first and the Vaughn parcel came later around it." He paused. "They had a falling out in 1875. Something about money, the way my father told it. Caldwell left. My father bought him out for far less than the parcel was worth and called it settling the accounts." Another pause longer. "I found the actual accounting books after my father died. What my father paid Caldwell was not a fair settlement. It was closer to theft, dressed up in legal language, but theft." Jennie was quiet, waiting. "Caldwell had a daughter," Jasper said. "She would have been young then, a child. I tried to find them to make it right. Caldwell died in 1879. The daughter, I don't know where she is. I've had a lawyer in Cheyenne looking for 3 years, nothing." "That's why you left the fence post to rot," Jennie said. It was not an accusation. It was the same thing she said when she identified a compromised geological structure, a statement of the underlying cause. He looked at her then. Something raw and undefended in his face that she suspected very few people, possibly no one living, had ever been permitted to see. "I don't go to that section much," he said. "The guilt lives there," Jennie said. He did not answer. He did not need to. She refilled his coffee cup from the camp pot without comment, and they sat in the lengthening summer evening, and the silence was full of something complicated and real, and the particular intimacy of two people who have shared the kind of truth that cannot be unshared. She found herself thinking about that conversation in the following days with more frequency than was entirely comfortable, replaying not just the content but the specific quality of his voice when he spoke about it. The controlled difficulty of a man forcing himself to say something he had been holding alone for years, and the particular way he had looked at her in that moment of rawness, as if he was slightly uncertain of the ground beneath his feet and slightly relieved to be uncertain. She thought about it while she was calculating drainage angles, and while she was supervising the installation of the irrigation channels, and while she was nailing planks on her house floor, which was not especially conducive to accurate nailing and resulted in 2 bent nails in one afternoon, which was 2 more bent nails than she normally produced in a week. She was not a woman who had spent much time on romantic thoughts, not because she was incapable of them, but because she had been too busy and too purposeful, and too aware that most men she encountered were not going to be able to keep pace with her mind or respect the full scope of what she was. That awareness had been a kind of protection accurate, but perhaps slightly too complete, perhaps used for purposes beyond simple realism. The following Tuesday, when Jasper came to check the irrigation infrastructure, She was standing at the top of the holding basin wall doing a level reading when she heard him arrive and did not immediately come down. And when she finally did, she found him standing in her partial house looking at the bookshelves she had already built and installed, running one finger along the spines of the volumes she had brought west in her trunk. He turned when she came in through the open doorway and held up the copy of her father's surveying manual, a privately printed technical volume that had her father's name, Thomas Gentry, on the spine. "Your father wrote this," he said. "Yes." He turned it over in his hands carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to someone's grief. "It's well known in the trade. I have a copy in my own library." Jennie stopped where she was. "You have a copy of my father's surveying manual." "My father had it first. I read it when I was 20. It's how I understood what the alkaline deposits on the eastern pasture were doing to the soil structure." He looked at her steadily. "I recognized the name when you introduced yourself. I wasn't sure if you were related to him." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Why didn't you say something?" "I was deciding whether to trust it," he said. She understood that. She understood it so completely and from such a deep place of her own particular kind of guardedness that she could not be anything other than honest with him about it. "I do the same thing," she said. "I collect information before I commit to a position. It's a surveyor's habit." "It's a survival habit," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. He set the book back on the shelf carefully, exactly where he had found it. They were standing in the unfinished room of her half-built house in the Wyoming summer afternoon, and the air between them had the specific quality of two people who have navigated very carefully toward each other from a long distance and have arrived, somewhat to their own surprise, at a very close proximity. "Jennie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it changed the texture of the whole room, the whole afternoon, everything. She waited. "I don't know how to do this," he said. The admission came out with the careful difficulty of a man dismantling his own architecture piece by piece. "I've been told. I know what people say about me. Cold. Unreachable. I know it's not entirely unearned. It's not entirely accurate either," she said. He looked at her. "You reach back," she said. "The morning I asked about the soil, you could have walked away. You've done it to everyone else. You didn't do it to me." "You asked the right question," he said. "I asked a question that meant something real," she said. "That's different from the right question. People ask you useful questions all the time, probably. You walk away from those. I asked a question that connected to something you actually cared about." She paused. "And you answered." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've been trying to find a reason to come to this property every Tuesday for a month, and the irrigation infrastructure doesn't require weekly inspection." "I know," she said. "I designed it. It requires monthly inspection at most." A moment of complete stillness. And then, for the first time since she had known him, something happened in Jasper Vaughn's face that was not the shadow of an expression or a barely there flicker of something. He smiled. It was brief and quiet and slightly rusty from disuse, but it was real, and it reached all the way to his gray eyes and changed them completely. She felt it in her chest like a struck bell. "I would like to come on Tuesdays anyway," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think I'd like that too." It was not, by the standards of the romantic novels that circulated at the Hargrove boarding house, a passionate declaration. It was two careful people acknowledging something true in the language they both spoke best: direct, precise, and completely honest. And it was, Jennie thought, considerably more than adequate. He came on Tuesdays, and on Thursdays, and occasionally on Saturdays, when he brought two of his hands, and they worked on the house, raising and framing, and made progress that would have taken her twice as long alone. She fed them lunch on those days. She was a capable enough cook, if not an inspired one, and the hands ate with the cheerful gratitude of men who spent most of their time subsisting on their own camp cooking. And Jasper sat at the rough lumber table she used as outdoor furniture and ate without comment, but always had a second helping. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Redemption Creek was not a place where anything happened without general observation and commentary, and Jasper Vaughn being seen regularly at the Gentry property was a development of sufficient novelty to generate significant social conversation. The widow Hargrove was pleased in the warm, slightly proprietary way of someone who believes they have been a useful background presence in a developing romance, despite having done essentially nothing. The blacksmith shook his head and said he would believe it when he saw it at the altar. Several of the younger women in town were reported to be quietly devastated, though they managed it with dignity. Jennie found all of it mildly entertaining and completely irrelevant. She had bigger things to think about. The most pressing was the Caldwell daughter. She had been thinking about what Jasper had told her on the porch that evening, the dark past of his father's betrayal of his partner, the hidden injustice in the north corner of the property, the search that had turned up nothing. It bothered her the way an unresolved survey discrepancy bothered her, as something that needed to be found and corrected before the whole picture could be considered complete. She did not tell Jasper what she was doing, because she did not want to raise false hope, and she was not certain she would find anything where his Cheyenne lawyer had not. But she had resources the lawyer did not. She had spent 4 years surveying across Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska, and she had contacts in land offices, postal offices, and county records across the territory that most lawyers did not cultivate. She began writing letters. She also spent a Sunday afternoon walking the north corner of his property. He had not explicitly invited her, but he had also not explicitly forbidden her since the conversation on the porch, and she decided that the latter was more functionally relevant. She brought her survey tools and her field notebook, and she walked the entire north parcel carefully, and what she found there was worth finding. The old Caldwell homestead structure was still standing, barely, but standing. It was a small sod house built in the original homesteading style, abandoned for 7 years and slowly returning to earth. There was a kitchen garden gone entirely to weeds and scrub. There was the remnant of a fence built differently from the Vaughn fence, a different post style, a different stringing pattern, the particular engineering signature of a different pair of hands. And there was, carved into the lintel of the doorway of the old sod house, a name and a date. Sarah Caldwell, 1872, not Aaron Caldwell, Sarah, a woman's name. A child's claim on a place, carved into the wood with the passionate permanence of someone who intended to remember. Jennie stood in front of that name for a long time. Then she took out her field notebook and wrote it down and added it to her letters. In August, 3 of her letters came back with useful information in the same week, and she sat at her desk in the nearly completed house and assembled the picture carefully. Sarah Caldwell was 30 years old. She was living in Laramie, Wyoming, working as a seamstress. She had been 14 when her father left Redemption Creek, and she had never returned. Her father, Aaron Caldwell, had died in a rooming house in Laramie in 1879, with essentially nothing to his name, which was consistent with Jasper's account of what his own father had paid for the north parcel. Jennie wrote to Sarah Caldwell directly. She explained who she was and what she knew, and what she believed was owed, in careful, honest language that did not dress the injustice up in anything softer than what it was. She also told Jasper. She chose a Tuesday morning when he arrived for his standing visit, and she handed him Sarah Caldwell's address and the letter she had written before sending it, so he could read what she had said about him and his intentions. He read it standing in the yard of her house, very still in the way of a man absorbing something large and complicated. When he looked up, there were expressions on his face she had never seen there before, layered over each other, relief and grief and something that might have been gratitude but was too deep and private to name easily. "You found her," he said. "I found her," Jennie said. "What happens next is your decision." He looked at the address for a long moment. "Will you come with me to Laramie?" She had not expected that. She considered it for a moment, the professional and personal dimensions of the request, and then she said yes, because it was the right answer, and because she understood that he was asking not as someone who could not go alone, but as someone who trusted her to be there. They went to Laramie in the second week of August on the territorial stage, which was a full day's travel, and involved sitting next to each other for several hours in close quarters with nothing particular to do, which produced, in two people who had been carefully not quite touching for 8 weeks, a specific kind of charged awareness that made the day simultaneously very long and very short. In Laramie, they found Sarah Caldwell in a small but neat seamstress's shop near the stage depot. She was a composed, weathered woman with a watchful quality that reminded Jennie of Jasper, the bearing of someone who has learned to expect difficulty and has made their peace with it. Jasper explained himself to her without qualification or evasion: the accounting books, what he had found, what his father had done, what he believed was owed. He did not ask for forgiveness. He offered restitution, the cash value of the difference between what Aaron Caldwell was paid and what the North Parcel was actually worth in 1875, with 7 years of simple interest, in addition to the deed to the North Parcel itself if she wanted it. Sarah Caldwell sat with this information for several minutes without speaking, and then she said very quietly, "I carved my name over the door of that house when I was 10 years old." "I know," Jasper said. "I saw it." Another long silence. "The deed," she said. "I don't want to live there, but I want the deed, and my father's name on a correction to the land records." "Both of those," Jasper said. "Yes." Sarah looked at Jennie. "Are you his wife?" "Not yet," Jennie said, and heard her own words a half-second after she said them and felt the heat rise to her face, which was not a reaction she was accustomed to. Jasper said nothing. She could not see his expression because she was looking at Sarah Caldwell, but she heard the smallest change in his breathing, which told her enough. The legal documentation took 2 days to arrange. They stayed in Laramie in separate accommodations, which was proper and correct, and also in the evenings produced long conversations on the front porch of the Laramie Hotel that lasted well past 9 o'clock when the summer dark finally settled over the town, and the stars came out enormous and dense over the Wyoming plains. On the second evening, sitting in the hotel porch chairs with the specific intimacy of two people who have shared 2 days of something significant together, Jasper said, without particular preamble, "You said not yet." "I know," Jennie said. "Was that a statement or a question?" he said. She looked at him in the lamplight from the hotel window. He was looking back at her with those gray eyes that were not remotely cold right now, had not been cold in weeks, had somewhere in the past months shifted from winter stone to something warmer and steadier and entirely more dangerous. "I think," Jennie said carefully, "that it was an accurate observation about the current state of affairs." "And what would change the current state of affairs?" he said. "Ask me," she said. He leaned forward slightly in the chair, his forearms on his knees, and looked at her with the focus he brought to the things that genuinely mattered to him. "Jennie Gentry," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not framed as a question, which was in perfect character. It was framed as a man stating something he had already decided was true and inviting her to confirm it. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and held it carefully, with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything, and the contact was so specific and so long anticipated that she felt it from her fingers to her spine. They sat on the hotel porch in Laramie in the August dark holding hands and saying very little more, which was, Jennie thought, a perfectly sufficient first engagement. They were married in October. The ceremony was held at the Redemption Creek Church on a bright fall day when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold, and the air had the first edge of coming winter in it. The widow Hargrove cried, which surprised no one. The blacksmith, who had bet against this event occurring, paid up with moderately good grace. Sarah Caldwell sent a letter from Laramie that arrived the week before the wedding, brief but warm, wishing them well, and noting that she had received the deed and the corrected land records, and that something her father had carried silently for years had been, if not erased, at least acknowledged and addressed. The north corner of the Vaughn Ranch. It became the Vaughn Ranch in full. Jennie, having taken his name alongside her own, was fenced properly that fall. the post set right, the line walked and measured. They walked it together on a November morning with frost in the grass and their breath making small clouds in the cold air. And Jennie drove the last stake at the northern corner herself with the mallet she had been using since she was 12 years old on survey expeditions with her father. Jasper watched her drive it in and said, "I think you enjoyed that more than any other stake on the property line. This one closes the circuit," she said. "There's something satisfying about closing circuits." "Is there?" he said, and the way he said it had nothing to do with fence stakes. She looked at him over her shoulder, and he was watching her with an expression that was entirely open now, entirely unguarded, the face of a man who had stopped building walls because he had found something better to do with the same energy. It was, she thought, the most handsome she had ever seen him, and she had been finding him increasingly handsome since approximately the third Tuesday morning of their acquaintance, which she had studiously not mentioned until recently, and was now entirely free to think about as often as she liked. "Yes," she said. "There is." They rode back to the ranch house in the November cold, with the frost-silver grassland running in every direction and the sky enormous and pale above them. And she thought about the word that the widow Hargrove had used on the morning she arrived in Redemption Creek, the same word that was carved into the town's name, a word that meant something very specific in the theology of the frontier, not just being forgiven but being changed, being brought back from somewhere cold and lost into something warm and real. Redemption. It was, she thought, an accurate description of what she had watched happen to a man who everyone said was unreachable, in the span of one spring and one summer, and one fall on the eastern Wyoming grassland, because someone had asked him one specific question over a broken fence post, and he had chosen to answer. Life on the ranch through the first winter of their marriage was exactly as full and demanding as Jennie had anticipated, and then some. She ran her irrigation system through its first low-water season, making careful adjustments based on the data she collected, and she managed the early stages of soil amendment on the eastern pasture, and she worked on the detailed design of the next phase of the irrigation expansion she planned for the spring. In between all of this, she was also learning, for the first time in her life, what it meant to share a home with another person, not the boarding house coexistence she had known in Redemption Creek for those early months, but the real, daily, intimate architecture of a shared life. It suited her. She had not been entirely certain it would, had harbored a private concern that she was too independent and too particular in her habits, and too accustomed to her own complete authority over her own time and space to navigate the adjustment easily. But Jasper turned out to be a man who understood the need for uninterrupted work with a depth that only another person who genuinely needed the same thing could provide. He did not interrupt her when she was calculating. She did not interrupt him when he was managing the ranch. They worked in parallel for large portions of every day, and came together for meals and evenings with the specific pleasure of two people who have been genuinely productive separately, and have something real to say to each other as a result. He taught her things she had not known, the management of cattle, the particular rhythms of the ranch year, the network of relationships and responsibilities that held a working operation together. She taught him things he had not known, or had known only partially, the deeper geology of the valley, the engineering principles behind her irrigation work, the way her father's surveying manual translated into the actual practices of field survey. He turned out to be an eager student when the material genuinely interested him, which was in stark contrast to his reputation for impenetrability, and confirmed her long-standing professional conviction that most intractable geological problems were not actually intractable. They were just approached from the wrong angle. In February of their first winter, she told him she was expecting a child. He received this information standing in the kitchen of the ranch house on a Tuesday morning. Tuesdays had retained their particular significance. She had made sure of that, holding a coffee cup, and processing what she had just said with the characteristic stillness, of a man managing a significant response. Then he set the coffee cup down very carefully on the table, crossed the kitchen, and held her face in both of his large, work-rough hands and looked at her with an expression so unguarded and so full that she felt her own careful composure come almost entirely loose. "Jennie," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you?" "I'm fine. I'm perfectly healthy. I've consulted with Mrs. Hargrove, who delivered 12 babies in this valley, and she says everything is exactly as it should be." He pressed his forehead to hers and stood there for a moment in the February morning with the cold outside and the wood stove crackling and the particular silence of two people holding something new and extraordinary between them. "I was afraid of this," he said quietly. Not afraid of the pregnancy itself. She understood him well enough to hear what he meant. Afraid of loving something this much, of having this much to lose. The dark past of his isolation had been built precisely around this fear, the fear of loving and losing. "I know," she said again. "I know you were." "I'm not afraid of it now," he said. It was not entirely true, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, because the courage was in doing it anyway. The baby arrived in the first week of September, a boy, healthy and furious, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's absolute refusal to be quiet about what he needed. They named him Thomas for her father. When Jennie held him the first time and looked at his small, outraged, astonishing face, she thought about all the roads that had led to this particular moment, the survey expeditions, and the certificate, and the savings account and the parcel in Cheyenne and the broken fence post, and the question she had asked a cold, walled-off, remarkable man on a Tuesday morning in May. She thought about her father, who had taken an 8-year-old girl into the field and handed her a measuring rod and said that the land would always tell you the truth if you knew how to ask it. She thought her father would have liked Jasper Vaughn very much. He would have liked the way Jasper listened, and the way Jasper's hands were careful with things that mattered, and the way Jasper had looked at her father's book in her own library and said it was well known in the trade, with a precision and sincerity that told her he meant it. She thought he would have liked, most of all, the way Jasper sat beside her that first evening with Thomas in the ranch house, not saying anything because there was nothing to say that improved on the situation, just present and steady and entirely real. The following spring, Jennie oversaw the second phase of the irrigation expansion and the first real harvest from the eastern parcel. A modest crop of winter wheat and an early planting of kitchen garden vegetables, more a proof of concept than a commercial operation, but proof enough. The eastern pasture, with 2 years of soil amendment and managed water, was already showing the productivity improvement she had projected. And for Jasper, who had inherited a piece of his property he had essentially written off as lost land, watching those eastern acres green up and carry cattle that had no business being there before, was a particular satisfaction that he expressed in the specific Vaughn style of saying very little but meaning it completely. "You were right about the soil," he told her one morning in April, watching the cattle graze the eastern pasture. "I know," she said, "but you're welcome." He looked at her sideways with that quiet, barely there smile that she had come to know as one of the most expressive things about him, and she felt the same struck-bell feeling in her chest that she had felt the first time she saw it in her half-built house a year ago, entirely undiminished. Sarah Caldwell came to Redemption Creek that summer, not to reclaim the north parcel, but to see it. She came on the stage, and Jennie met her at the depot with Thomas on her hip, and a borrowed horse saddled for the ride out to the property. Sarah walked through the old sod house on the north corner with the careful, feeling attention of someone returning to a place they have carried for a long time, and she stood in front of the carved name over the door for a long while without speaking. When she turned around, her eyes were wet but her expression was composed. "I don't want to live here," she said again, "but I'm glad it's looked after." "We'll look after it," Jasper said from behind Jennie. Sarah looked at him for a moment with the particular measuring regard of someone who has worked out their own relationship with an old injustice and is deciding whether the person in front of them has too. "I know," she said finally. "I can see that." They had dinner at the ranch house that evening, the four of them, Sarah, Jennie, Jasper, and Thomas, who was almost 1 year old and had recently discovered that he could roll a wooden spool across the floor and retrieve it, which occupied him completely. And the dinner conversation ranged across the practical and the personal in the easy way of people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side. Sarah had a dry intelligence and a sharp humor that had survived everything her life had put it through, and she made Jasper laugh twice, which Jennie observed with the specific pleasure of someone watching two things that belong in the same world finally find each other. Sarah went back to Laramie 2 days later. She and Jennie continued to write letters, and the correspondence became, over the following years, one of the genuine friendships of both their lives. By the time Thomas was 2 and walking with the absolute confidence of someone who had no awareness of obstacles, the Vaughn ranch had changed in ways that were visible from the road. The eastern pasture was productive. The irrigation system had been extended to cover the full acreage of Jennie's original parcel, which was now farming in earnest wheat, corn, kitchen garden, an orchard of young fruit trees that would take years to bear fruit, but were already growing with the patient certainty of things properly planted. The north corner had a proper fence and a repaired sod house that served as a line camp for the ranch hands during the far-range seasons. The town had changed too, in the specific way that one change makes room for others. The visible proof that Jennie's irrigation model worked had generated considerable interest from the other small landholders in the valley, and by 1884, she had been contracted to survey and design irrigation works for 4 other properties in the Redemption Creek area, which was a professional development that satisfied her immensely and provided a steady income that was entirely her own earning. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne had taken notice. In the fall of 1884, she received a formal letter from the Wyoming Territory Surveyor General's office requesting her professional opinion on a regional watershed management question, an acknowledgement, formal and official, of what she had built and what she knew. She showed Jasper the letter across the dinner table. He read it carefully and then looked at her and said, with the quiet, precise pride of a man who means something completely, "You should write back immediately." "I intend to," she said. Thomas looked between his parents and demanded more bread, which was fully consistent with his general approach to life, and the evening proceeded. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1885. A boy again. They named him William, for Jasper's father, a choice that cost Jasper something to make but that he made deliberately, because he had spent enough time with the accumulated weight of the past to know that carrying it without naming it was harder than naming it and setting it down. William was a calmer child than Thomas, observant and quiet in a way that reminded Jennie of his father, with the gray eyes they all seemed to carry, and a habit of watching everything in a room before deciding what to do about it. With 2 children and a full professional practice and the ongoing work of the ranch, their life was large and full, and demanding in all the ways that a life built on genuine work and genuine love was demanding, which is to say constantly and valuably. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat together on the porch that Jasper had extended and improved from the original rough lumber structure. And sometimes they talked and sometimes they were quiet. And both the talking and the quiet had the quality of something that had been hard-won and was therefore valued with a specific attention that people who found things easily could not entirely appreciate. On one particular evening in the summer of 1885, 3 years after Jennie Gentry had stepped off the afternoon stage in Redemption Creek with her leather satchel and her father's compass, and her absolute refusal to accept the verdict that some things were unreachable on that evening, she was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea and her field notebook, making notes for the Territorial Surveyor General's report. And Jasper came out from inside and sat beside her and looked at the valley for a moment in the last long light of the Wyoming summer. "I want to tell you something," he said. She put her pencil down and looked at him. "When you pulled that fence post out of the ground the first morning," he said, "when you held it up and asked me about the alkaline deposits," he stopped for a moment, looking for the words in the way he had for things that mattered. "Nobody had asked me a real question in a very long time. I had gotten very good at making sure of that." She waited. "I want you to know that I knew," he said. "When I answered you, I knew it was different. I knew something was changing. I chose it. I want you to understand that it was a choice." Jennie looked at him in the last warm light of the summer evening, at this man who had been carved from Wyoming stone and had chosen to be something more than that, who had met her question with an answer and kept answering, who had walked fence lines and excavations with her, and held her father's book carefully, and looked for Aaron Caldwell's daughter for 3 years, because an injustice was an injustice regardless of whether anyone was watching, who had held her face in both hands in a February kitchen and told her he was not afraid anymore, even when they both knew he was. "I know," she said. "I knew it too." He took her free hand in his and held it, and they sat on the porch in the summer dark while the Wyoming night settled over the valley and the creek ran in the distance. And inside the house, their 2 sons slept soundly, and the future was not a closed and walled-off thing, but something open and possible and entirely worth building toward. The broken fence post had been replaced, properly set in amended soil, standing straight and solid on the eastern boundary line. Every spring she walked that fence line and checked it, not because she needed to, but because it was how this had started, with a question over a broken fence post, and an answer that changed everything. And she thought the least she owed the thing was an annual inspection. The last time she walked it alone, she brought Thomas with her, who was old enough now to walk the line without being carried, and she showed him how to look at the base of a post to read what the soil was doing to it, how to watch for the signs of trouble before the trouble became a failure, how to ask the right question when you found something that needed answering. "What do you do if someone doesn't answer?" Thomas asked, being a child who thought about things carefully, as both his parents did. Jennie looked at the fence line running straight and solid across the Wyoming grassland, repaired and true, the boundary well marked between what had once been divided and was now joined. "You find the question that reaches them," she said. "There's always one. You just have to know what you're looking at well enough to find it." Thomas considered this with the gray-eyed seriousness of a child absorbing something important. Then he looked at the post nearest to him and examined the base with great concentration. "This one is good," he reported. "Yes," said Jennie Gentry Vaughn, "this one is good." And across the pasture, from the direction of the ranch house, she could see Jasper coming toward them with William on his shoulders, and the long Wyoming afternoon light turning everything gold around them. And the valley was full of everything they had built, and the fence line was straight and solid and complete, and there were no broken posts left, and no hidden debts unpaid, and no dark corners of the land or the heart left unwalked and unexamined. There was only the forward motion of a life built deliberately and loved honestly, running straight as a survey line into a future that neither of them could fully see, but that both of them, without reservation, trusted.